Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. Um, Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Irving Finkel. Irving Finkel has been the cuneiform tablet curator of the British Museum since 1979. He's especially interested in ancient magic and medicine and all aspects of ancient cuneiform literature, and also works on the history of the world's board games. As well as writing professionally, he also publishes fiction for adults and children and collects many things. He is the founder of the Great Diary Project and has done a great deal of radio, television, and YouTube broadcasting. Um, the name of the lecture is The First Ghosts, Most Ancient of Legacies. Please, Irving, take it away.
Thank you very much. What a sweet introduction. Good. So that's me, and my title is The First Ghosts. And why it's called the most ancient of legacies, I hope you will come to understand. So firstly, the department I work in is called the Middle East Department in the British Museum, and it centers on the part of the world which is referred to by the media as the Middle East, but actually it is ancient Iraq and Iran and the surrounding countries. And I read inscriptions which come from ancient Iraq, written by Sumerians and Babylonians, and that is the land which is more or less conveniently bordered by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, which are invisible in blue in the middle of this drawing of Iraq. This is supposed to be for junior school children, but it always seems to me that it's a good start with maps if you start off like that. I find this myself quite sufficiently confusing as it is anyway. So you can see before the world map changes entirely what it's like. And this is the part of the world with Baghdad in the middle, with Assyria up in the north, and the Sumerian city-states down in the south. So cuneiform writing, I hope you know what it looks like. It looks most of all like Weetabix before you put the milk on. That's to say it's the same sort of shape, size, and color, and it has kind of impressions in it, but it's actually made of clay and written with a stylus. You can see on the right an Assyrian from a wall painting of about 800 BC. He's got his tablet in the left hand and his stylus in the right, and he, having gone to school and worked very hard for 10 years, is able to write down his own language, the Assyrian language, by ear or by dictation or by knowledge. So this is a royal scribe at work with his clay tablet. And his language, Assyrian, although it's completely extinct, is related to modern languages, some modern languages. So, for example, if you see a text in Assyrian put into English transliteration with the words written out with our alphabet, if you know Arabic or Hebrew or Syriac, Aramaic, Ethiopic, any of those modern Semitic languages, you will immediately be able to see which bit are the verbs, which bit are the female bits, and so forth and so forth. It's a Semitic language, exactly the same as modern ones, but it happens to be dead and finished. So that's one of the languages, but the earlier language was spoken by this priest on the left, who is a sculptor in the British Museum. He's a Sumerian speaker, or rather he was a Sumerian speaker. I've often whispered into his ear in the gallery when nobody is looking to try and find out whether he might say something, but he never does. So he has a shaved head and large eyes and a rather complacent belly with his hands folded across them. He's a Sumerian priest, and his language, in contrast to Assyrian, is equally, so to speak, unique. It's even uniquer, you might say. It's the first language which we know about in writing, but it has no modern relatives at all, or any ancient relatives. So this is a remarkable thing because everybody knows about language. You have Assyrians, I mean, you have French, Latin, Hittite, um, Sanskrit, they're all members of the Indo-European group. They're tied together. They have something of a common origin. And many of the world's languages belong somewhere on a family tree in that way. But Sumerian has no congeners, no cousins, no remote distant relatives of any kind, dead or alive. So this means that the cuneiform script has preserved for us these two languages side by side. And if we didn't have cuneiform tablets, we never would have suspected that Sumerian ever existed. So, in case you're not quite familiar with what these ridiculous signs look like, this picture will give you two important pieces of evidence. The cuneiform script is written by pressing a chopstick, so to speak, into a surface of clay and producing wedge shapes with the tip of the stylus. So when you analyze the signs, they only have three components. So when you're a young student and you have to learn to do this writing, you have to only learn three different strokes. One of them is a vertical wedge. So you see the big thing on the left, which underneath it says it's called Gedim. Well, Gedim is the Sumerian word, and Atemu is the Assyrian word, which is borrowed from it because they had the situation in antiquity that an old language sometimes lends words or they get adapted into a more modern language which accompanies it or replaces it, exactly like Latin and Greek go into English in many words and so forth. It's a common principle and it applied in antiquity. So scribes had to learn the Sumerian language and the Assyrian language both together. So that big sign at the top, you can see it has four individual vertical strokes, look a bit like narrow pieces of cheese or arrows. They used to call it arrow-headed. So that sign has four uprights. It has one very long horizontal and then three other shorter horizontals and a few other little bits at different angles. That's to say diagonal. So if you can make those different shapes with your stylus writing on your tablet, you can do anything. So that's quite a big sign. So in the Mesopotamian world, if you were an exorcist, we'll probably meet some people who dealt with evil spirits and evil ghosts. These were crucial vocabulary that had to be mastered. And the one on the left means ghost. By that, it means the same thing as we do, that was what left of a person when their body is rotted away, the essence of a human being that survives somehow or other, and things happen to it. So that's it. The Atemu was what King Nebuchadnezzar called a ghost, Atemu. Now, on the right, there's one other sign. Actually, there are horrible pictures of me. I don't know if we can get rid of them. But on the right, there's another big sign, which is almost the same, except that if you look at the beginning, there are three vertical wedges, one smaller than the other two. So the first sign for ghost has two tall wedges in upright position. And this other one, which means demon, has three uprights with the smaller one tucked inside. Otherwise, it's the same. So this might look like a load of gobbledygook to you and neither here nor there, but actually it's rather revealing because you see underneath that if you dismantle these big signs, they are formed of a fraction and the signs Ishtar. Now, I hope you've all heard of Ishtar because Ishtar was the beauteous goddess of love and warfare and many other things as well. She was hot stuff, Ishtar, and she was in fact the number one goddess. But the common noun Ishtar means divine female. It doesn't mean the goddess Ishtar, but divine femininity. So you have a sign which, when it means ghost, consists of the fraction 1/3 with the ish and tar stuck inside. This is rather interesting because the ish has two verticals, you will see, and two horizontals and the other wiggly bits. They're all there, kind of stretched out and plonked between the bits of fencing. And it's exactly the same with the word udug, which means demon, which is utuku in Babylonian, another loan word, as you can obviously see, which means a demon in the simple sense of the word, because the ghost is the remains of a human being, and a demon never was no human being. They are just malevolent and wicked things. So, what is philosophically interesting is that the distinction in the Babylonian mind, in as much as it was given to speculation, concluded that for a ghost of human ancestry, 1/3 of it was made up of divine femininity, or the quality of divine femininity, meaning that you had flesh and blood, and then the special bit. And when it came to ghosts, the portion, component of the ghost was 2/3 divine femininity, but we don't know what the other third was. So this is an ongoing problem. So in this way, the words differentiate between these two things, neither of which can normally be seen, and one of them is possessed of human characters, and the other one has no human characters at all, especially not mercy. Oh, I see we have to do this. So I told you that we have to distinguish between ghosts and demons. Well, we start off with the other lot. This is a piece of real magic on the left. It's an amulet, about 600 BC, and it has on it a lion-headed demoness holding snakes, being and suckling a wolf and a wolf and some other quadruped like a dog, God knows what. That's what she is, and she's riding on the back of a donkey, and there are bits and pieces carved in the back. This is called Lamashtu, this demon. She was the personification of the dangers of childbirth, because child mortality was unquestionably very common in antiquity, like it is today in many parts of the world. And the fear of childbirth and what might happen was personified with this lion-headed demoness. So she was definitely a demon, nothing to do with ghosts, very demonic. Her father was chief of the gods. She'd done something very naughty and been sent down to the netherworld, where she lurked, waiting to get new babies. And I put this grotesque picture up next to it for one simple and clear reason. Because when we're talking about these ancient people, about ghosts and about demons and so forth, we are not dealing with a conventional reference system which has nothing to do with belief. They didn't have a detached view of this where they said ghosts without worrying about what ghosts or demons, they're so to speak demons or anything like that. It's nothing of the case. It's nothing of the case. And this horrendous picture, which is freely available on the internet to people who want to find out about ancient Mesopotamia. This is supposed to be a fetus and so forth. But I put it up because it actually is what they were thinking this demoness was like. So when you have a pale green piece of stone, very no color, no sharp relief, covered a bit with dust from a museum or clay from the ground, you can look at it, but you don't have any feeling of horror. You don't have any sensation of what might be behind it, or how meaningful it was. And then when you look at this other thing, and then you imagine that the women in childbirth, as the partition approached, they were very frightened, and their husbands too, and so forth. So we're dealing with stuff here which is not a pretty thing, but it's real. Gosh, hold on. How do we turn this on? Uh-oh, I need to go forward. Um, yeah, thank you. Yes. By the way, did anybody see that film called The Exorcist? I don't know if anybody did. If you haven't, don't. It is unbelievably grotesque. But I draw it to your attention for a particularly serious reason, because in the hands of Hollywood, the truth about antiquity is horribly exploited. So you see this lady on the right. She had rather a grim experience attributed by the priest on the left, who died, serves him right, um, to this demon, which is upstairs looking at you and staring at you. His name is Pazuzu. And according to the film, this thing took this girl and made her into a monster. And the whole film had a lovely time explaining how horrible it could be. Now, the thing is this, the important thing is this, that this Pazuzu was on our side and not on their side. He was a good demon, and he was the one that drove away that Lamashtu. They had a very bad relationship. So if you hung this up at the head of the bed, if the Lamashtu looked through the window, came to get you, that would be sufficient to drive her away. So they had kind of rules. They obeyed rules, a bit like the so-called rules of warfare, where everybody knows what you have to do and what you can't do and everything. And sometimes the interplay between the human world and these other worlds operates on certain principles. So if you had Pazuzu there, you would be safe. Anyway, we're really talking about ghosts. Now, ghosts are a very fascinating thing. There's much to be said about them, but what I've got here is a distillation of most of the main things which I wrote about when I wrote that book about it. And it's interesting for lots of reasons, but one of them is that the underlying ideas, the principles behind it, what it's all about, is not by any means bizarre or unfamiliar to the modern mind. In other words, people today have very similar ideas about this material, sometimes in one part of the world, sometimes in another. So the Mesopotamians invented many things, writing and the wheel, but they didn't invent death. People died anyway. And when they died, they were stuck in the ground with, in this case, you can see some vessels, bits and pieces, I don't know what, things that they might need in their normal life, and buried. And when they were buried, they were supposed to stay there. This was the whole rules of the game. There was a special ritual by the officiating priest, and sometimes they were obliged to um, recite special things to make sure, but once they were down there, they were supposed to stay there, and that is that. And of course, most good ghosts did that. However, not all of them did. So we have literature and proceedings and spells and operations in order to deal with people who came up from below for one reason or another and frightened or tormented or irritated those who were still above ground. So these are two pieces of literature. Um, just a second. Oh, good. Thank you. These are two pieces of literature which I'm so sorry. I can't quite control. Just a second. Certainly, yes, these give a window on what people thought about this um, primary situation, that their dead auntie was under the ground, often buried under the ground of the courtyard where everybody lived, with all the stuff she would need, and we didn't expect to be seeing her again. So these two texts are a reflection of it. One of them, they're both in the Assyrian language. You are the offspring of the wind. I've laid you in the grave. I've sent you down. Why did you not fear my solemn oath? So this is an outraged um, priest or operator who dealt with this kind of thing, and he'd done all the right things, solemn oath, and so here lies, and so forth and so forth. And then, well, what do you know? We are back. So this is a small spell which is to the point. And this other thing is something quite different. If ever, a long time from now, far into future time in the days to come, anyone should find this tomb, may he not clear it away, may he restore it. May that man who finds this not despise it, rather he should say as follows: this tomb I shall certainly restore, and may the favor that he does be requited him. Above, may his omens be propitious, and below, may his ghosts drink pure water. So those last two sentences are rather revealing, because ancient Mesopotamians had a great weakness for learning the future by means of omens. That's to say, collecting phenomena, accidental, deliberate, solicited, or observed, as it may be, the sight of which implied something that was going to happen. So if this happens, then that happens. And there are hundreds and hundreds of lines of omens of all different kinds, organized into compositions in the cuneiform libraries of, for example, Nineveh. And one collection, one opus, you might say, is concerned with omens about what it means if you see a ghost. and they focused a lot of attention on it. If you see them on such and such a day or another such a day, or you saw them in this room or in that room, or you saw them at this time of day, and all the possibilities are there, so that if you see a ghost, so to speak, and you're upset by it, you go to a professional who will go through these things, these sightings, until they find one or two which might correlate with what had been experienced. So they can say, oh, this is probably your uncle. Did he look anything like your uncle? That kind of thing. It was a tool. And the second point, below, may his ghosts drink pure water, is not just mere talk, because ghosts down there were very desperate to get pure water, because on the whole, things weren't so smart or so comfortable. And in fact, getting good water is a difficult matter, even though, of course, you might say, well, this is stupid because they didn't have throats or they couldn't swallow and anything. Why would a ghost? But it's a kind of principle. But actually, if the oldest son, who when someone was buried in the under the courtyard of the house, where in the family tomb, if he forgot to give the offerings, then this is the sort of thing that would get one of these ghosts to come back indignant, because they are entitled to offerings of liquid and offerings of food, and where are they? And if they don't come, they're back with a vengeance and pull people's hair and all manner of other nasty things. So this is a picture of a naked goddess. You can see she's a goddess. She's got a crown on. She's got wings. She's got feathered feet crouching on her pet lions, and there are owls, and the whole thing is redolent of the nether world or the underworld, and she has these two peculiar symbols. And this lady, in my opinion, is Inanna. Now, the thing is, the story on the left is an important piece of literature, which, if you ever decide to take Assyriology for your new career, and I hope you will be one of the texts you read as soon as you've got the hang of the script, grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and all the other things to which you would have to devote your waking hours. And this tablet on the left is called Inanna's Descent. And in Inanna's Descent, the priestess, the goddess, goes down to the underworld to confront her sister, Eresh Kigal, because her own lover, Dumuzi, who is the god in charge of flocks of animals and vegetation and life and abundance, went down there and was trapped down there. And of course, everything was disastrous upstairs, including Ishtar herself. So she went down to try and recapture from her wicked sister her lover. So this is how it begins in English. To the land of no return, the realm of Eresh Kigal, Ishtar, the daughter of the moon, set her mind. To the dark house, the abode of Irkalla, to the house which none leave who have entered it, to the road from which there's no way back, to the house wherein the entrance are bereft of light, where dust is their fare and clay their food, where they see no light, residing in darkness, where they are clothed like birds with wings for garments, and where over door and bolt is spread dust. So that's where Inanna Ishtar, had to go, the realm of Eresh Kigal, to retrieve her boy. There's a long narrative here. This is just one section. You will soon see what I mean. Forth went the gatekeeper to open the door for her. It's a bit further on, because she, on the path down, gone through the main gate, knocked on the door. Enter, my lady, that Cutha may rejoice over thee, that the palace of the land of no return may be glad at thy presence. When the first gate he had made her enter, he stripped and took away the great crown on her head, which you've seen. Why, O gatekeeper, did thou take the great crown on my head? Enter, my lady, thus are the rules of the mistress of the underworld. Well, Ishtar had never heard about this rule. never heard about it at all, but she was obliged to comply with it. And this remarkable survival of an ink drawing on a sheet of paper, which is 12,000 years old, shows you at a glimpse what she had to do. You see the ground, you see a ziggurat to tell you you are in Mesopotamia, you see the moon, a palm tree, and the first gate of the whole affair. Now, the gate to the entrance of the underworld was a real thing. It was located in this city, Cutha, where you see the message, the signpost. So if you went to Cutha in Babylonia, there was a special temple with this special access to the underworld, and Lord knows what happened inside it. We just don't know the details. Anyway, Inanna, or Ishtar, she was in this acceptation, had to go through 7 gates. And each time she went through a gate, the gatekeeper, in that oily and unpleasant way, forced her to take off an item of clothing. So by the time she got down to the end, in order to confront her wayward sister, she was stark naked. And of course, lost her dignity, and obviously it was to humiliate her. But what is interesting to me is because the bit I read out before is repeated each time. I didn't think that was necessary. But what is rather interesting is to find this, that in antiquity, in the understanding of how the world works, there was a little officious shit at a window with a thing underneath asking for a ticket. And people like that in the world are often governed by a malice and a desire to exploit people in general. For example, the railway station in Bombay is a perfect case. So the thing is this guide, they all decided that they could get this poor innocent goddess to take all her clothes off by saying this was the rule and she'd had no choice. So it was a typical example of somebody behind a little window and how girls are always exploited by the male sex. I think this is a very serious point. Next. She got him back, by the way. So this is the situation. We know that ghosts sometimes could come out. And we do know that on the whole, they had a kind of case. They had a sort of grievance. So when people talk about ghosts in their texts, they're not necessarily terrified, or even though the omens might predict something serious, the priests knew how to avert that evil. But on the whole, they had a sympathy for ghosts that if they were coming back, unless they were really horrible, then they probably had a good reason. So that is, I think, a rather endearing, but nevertheless a true situation. So if you had a ghost who came back, the first thing that would happen would be probably, as I always imagine it, somebody making a salad in the kitchen and a mouse runs across the kitchen floor. You jump 30 feet in the air. And then when you've come down, you think to yourself, confound it, I'll have to get somebody in to deal with it. What a pain. And that sort of jump plus have to do something mixture is almost certainly what happened when somebody saw a ghost, probably one from the family, for the first time before anything terrible happened. So what you could do is you could go down to the city gate or the souk, where the metalsmiths were and the seal cutters and people who made furniture and clothes and so like in a modern Middle Eastern city, if it hasn't been destroyed. Then there'd be a place where you could buy amulets from jobbing magicians who write out spells and they produce things on demand, which perhaps one of their colleagues had prescribed. So these two things, they're only about an inch long, in fact, they're inscribed and they say it's a spell of Marduk. This is a spell of Marduk, who was the god of magic, hot stuff. And it says, ghost, why do you keep appearing to me? That's what it says in the Akkadian line. Why do you keep appearing to me? And they both have the same spell on. And it's rather interesting because you can tell from the verb, which is a reiterative verb, that the person in question had had more than one of these visits, and it got from the point from being frightening and then being okay to being a little bit unpleasant. And maybe the time had come. So this is the question from powers that be, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And you'd wear this and hopefully that would be the end of it. Of course, may not necessarily be the end of it. If it wasn't the end of it, you might have to go and get a proper amulet from a proper amulet maker. Now, if you were really wealthy, this is the sort of thing you would get because this is made of obsidian, which is it's volcanic glass, and you don't find obsidian in in Iraq, but you do find it in Afghanistan in great abundance, sometimes in great wadis of stuff. It's common there, so to speak, if you know where to look, but it doesn't grow in the ground of Iraq. And so there was a bristling trade in obsidian, which was very, very hard material, could only be carved by experts, very expensive too. So this is an obsidian seal cut with very beautiful characters. And the spell is to get rid of a ghost. So you can see the top is broken, but originally there was a sort of flap and a hole went through it transversely, and you would wear this around your neck and you would be immune from attack by ghosts. And the words are interesting because if you know Sumerian or Akkadian and you read them, it's a bit difficult to understand what they mean. And I put them in different colors with a sort of translation. So Zizig and Nuedesh, Sagish, Luabdash. Those four words are powerful nails in the coffin of the ghost. It drive them away, it will hammer them down. Each one of those words is very powerful. And they're not in Akkadian, for the Babylonian, or Syrian, I mean, they're the same actually. Or in proper Sumerian, they're in a kind of funny Sumerian, and you can translate them as among living things, which is Zizig, do ye not come up, raise thy head, ye corpse. And I put the ye's in to give you the idea that the Sumerian is not real Sumerian. They've tried to make it look like ancient Sumerian. They put these sh endings on, which you hardly ever get in normal classical Sumerian. And it's a way to give it a kind of veneer of words from the remote time, something like that. And on top of it, the signs are written in an archaic form. So this thing was probably made in about 1100 BC, something like that. But the signs belong to something which is 1500 years older, a sort of monumental script. And so they tried to show that the spell, the amulet itself was very ancient and the words were very ancient and thereby, no doubt, jolly effective. And while we're on the subject of magic words against ghosts, look at this. This little tablet was written in 2042 BC in Sumerian, and it comes from this place, Drahem, in southern Iraq. And it explains that somebody called Zimzilach, who was an Elamite dog warden, receives a dead donkey. So it's a receipt for the corpse of this donkey, which be put to one use or another by a man called Zimzilach, who wasn't a Sumerian living in southern Iraq. He was an Elamite from Iran over the border who had come over with his dog or dogs to work in a Sumerian city. So just as people today travel to America to work or do something like, it's exactly the same situation. This in Elam, they had these mastiffs, which were very dangerous indeed, and they were wanted by the people who administered the city-states of Sumer to have those things to patrol at night and to keep off ill wishers and burglars and what have you. They were very, very fierce, and the only people who could look after them and keep them under control were the Elamites who bred them. So they came over and worked in Iraq. And one of the official people in this year recorded that this man, Zimzilach, had been given a dead donkey. I'm quite sure the dead donkey was to feed to his dogs. That's almost certainly what it was. So it's quite a serious job, specialist, dealing with these violent forces. Now, the thing is, you see, written in the 21st century BC. Now, what must have happened? What must have happened is this, that tablet was buried in the ground like all of the tablets are buried in the ground. And when you wrote a tablet like that, it's one day, 1 month, 1 year, when the thing happened. It's a very small record. And then eventually, at the end of the month, really boring clerks had to put all the entries from these small tablets in really big ones, like the size of a computer with the lid open, really large tablet with all the records from the whole month. And what must have happened is that there was a group of tablets to do with these Elamites who were the dog chaps. They probably all lived together. They probably everybody knew who they were and where they were. So this is one of them. But we can be sure that there were at least four. Why? Because many, many years later, after that tablet was written, I don't know how many years later, but probably in about the 9th century BC, something like that. So you can imagine. Somebody wrote down a spell against ghosts. And there are many examples of them. And look, the first one is, you can read like me, but Zinzilach, and then Zichilach, Ruchlach, Ruchtilla. That's the spell in an unknown language, not known to the Babylonians, that is, to get rid of a ghost. And another amulet has Ziib Shilach, Numelach, Hatilach, Guchlach. And the third one I found is Zib Shilach, like the second, Numelech, like the second, Shitilach, and Guchlach, and so forth. And the last one is Sentilach, Numelach, Nudlach, Sidlach. So you've got four amulets with these four words on to be used against ghosts. Now, what can we say about them? The fact is that we know that Zinzilach was an ancient name of a real person from Elam in Iran. And we know they kept records of these dog keepers together. So the likelihood is that somebody found a bit of tablet which had on it Zinzilach and Zichilach, Huchlach and Huchlach, the four Elamite dog handlers all together got their rations, they got their water, they've done their work, signed off. And so there are four of these names, so they must be four blokes. It's like Tom, Dick, Harry, and Richard, for example. But the interesting thing is that other amulets have texts which are almost the same to dispel ghosts, but they're not quite the same. Now, in the history of magic, the general rule is if you have magic words, you have to be very careful to make sure you get them perfectly right. Otherwise, they won't work. And I think people did their best, but you see, they didn't understand what these were. So they repeated them and repeated them. And like Chinese whispers, they get more and more distorted with the passage of time. People don't hear properly, they don't do it properly. And so you get circulating these strings of magic words, which are actually personal names, to get rid of ghosts. And the thing is, this is what we call mumbo jumbo in our language, which is exactly what it was, mumbo jumbo, like abracadabra. They were magic words. And here, we not only have a parallel to Babylonians using magic words in the first millennium, 1,000 years after the names were last ever heard on the ground, but also they don't know what they mean. They just copy them because some teacher or someone said, listen, this is a really good thing for ghosts, and then somebody else copies it, goes all over the place, and it gets garbled and garbled and garbled. So we have an exact parallel to our mumbo jumbo, but uniquely, we know what the original text means because we never do with most magic words, but here it's just four personal names. It's the most extraordinary thing. So amulets is one thing. Another thing, you can get the professionals to do a spell. So this is an incantation, which is labeled incantation against constantly seen dead persons. And then there's a ritual which the exorcist would come and do at the house. So a small ritual. So this is the spell. It's rather informative, a bit like the amulet. He says, dead persons, why do you keep appearing to me, you whose cities are ruin heaps and are mere bones? I will not go to Kutha. So this is the Kutha where Ishtar went down to the underworld, the ghosts' assembly point. You are conjured away by Queen Abatu, Queen Ereshkigal, whom we know, and Nin Geshtin Anna, the scribe of the gods. whose stylus is of lapis and carnelian. So Ningeshtina keeps an eye on those gates and finds out who comes through one way and who might possibly go out the other way. And then the ritual is nothing particularly exciting, but it says you may open up a pit towards the setting sun using a bronze spade. You put ditch water and roasted grain flour into an ox horn. You char something over the fire and stir it into the liquid. You recite the incantation we've just read. You cast the liquid into the well. You pass the censer and torch past the afflicted person. So this liquid will go down through the well into the netherworld and hopefully have the desired effect that they're looking for. There are more complicated things. I brought one or two to show you. This is the middle of a clay tablet written in about 600 BC. You can see it's broken in many places. You can see there's some cuneiform writing, I hope, going downwards, north to south, and also that there's a drawing. Now, your eye may not be attuned to looking for masterpieces etched in nice quality clay, but before you is a splendid example, because what you have here, you can see on the right, there is a pole with rings and someone's hands, one's holding the pole and the other one is holding a sort of flail in his left hand. His arms are outstretched. He has a long beard, a fine, handsome profile, and he's wearing the cap of a Babylonian king. And if you follow me across the gap to where the tablet is preserved, you can see the tall back of the throne, which runs all the way down, and you can see the little feet at the bottom drawn, the base of the base of the throne and the little feet at the bottom. So the king is seated on a throne, and his feet would bend knees would stick out beyond the little feet, and his would be on the floor. So that's quite a clear thing. It's very beautifully done, especially as writing is such a unforgiving sort of material. And then next to him is this other picture, which I've taken of the same tablet. And here, if you look carefully, you can see a figure mounted on a pole. Hold on a second. Yes, you'll have to take my word for it. But if you look carefully, there's a pole stuck in the ground, and on it there is a figure who has bobbed hair coming down with bobs on each side, and the arms are stretched out to left and right. So it's a figure without the lower part of the body, mounted on a pole with the arms sticking out like that. And unfortunately, the face is gone and the middle part is gone. And the thing is that in ancient Mesopotamian art, frontal views, so to speak, are very rare. And it's most unfortunate that it's not preserved. But we know that this figure is the vizier of this guy who is a king, and he's a king from before the flood. He's an ancient king and full of magic power. And this pair is set up at the head of the bed of someone who's having trouble with ghosts. And the king is there, being the sage possessed of this esoteric knowledge, and his assistant. And the instructions are written like this, that the exorcist, this figure with the outstretched hands and mounted, can spin. And the priest or whoever's sitting by the bed with the patient flicks one of the arms, and it must spin round and frighten off the ghosts, rather like you might try to get rid of insects or something of the kind. They leave, they go somewhere else because they're put off by this grotesque matter. So we don't have the little sculptures or all we have is these marvelous drawings, but it tells you quite a lot, quite a complicated thing to make this, probably out of metal, something like that, and it will be an expensive matter. But the thing is, I should say that when you have this idea about ghosts and that people are sympathetic to them, and on the whole they credit them with not being unreasonable, actually what happens is this, that there's a wide spectrum of ghostly types. ghostly behavior. And I think the rule is that people who are meek and mild and kindly in their lives, if they're ghosts, have the same properties. And people who are mean, nasty, or horrible and ugly, then in their ghosts, they are people of that kind. And people who are sadists and masochists, murderers, and Nazis will have the same characteristic in their ghosts. And this is what happens, that some of the spells are gentle and mild and not very violent, but sometimes ghosts went into the ear when you were asleep. It's impossible to sleep with both your ears covered, or almost impossible. Um, they That was the portal whereby a ghost got into a person, make them very ill indeed. And there's a lot of medical texts to deal with ear sickness and help a patient who's suffering and to drive the ghost out. And sometimes spells in Elamite are used for that very purpose, which correlates with the thing we just looked at, the mumbo jumbo words. Now, this is something which, if you're still awake, marvelous. If you're dozing off, you should sit up and pay attention, because the tablet on the left, you can see, photographed to its best ability, has a drawing on it. It's the lower third of a tablet. So there's writing along the bottom, writing along the top, and at least 2/3 more was there originally. It might even be in the British Museum, but I haven't been able to find it. So it was buried in the ground, and when it was dug up by somebody who lived near Babylon in the 19th century, in their excitement, um, looking for tablets to put onto the market, the tablet was broken, or it might have been broken already, but 2 gashes were across the surface of the tablet in the most unfortunate way, because that empty space has on it these 2 drawings, which have been filled in by my colleague Jamie Fraser. We did it with his computer, with using the photograph and following the lines and checking with the magnifying glass. So there's nothing invented. That's actually what's on the tablet, and you have to wiggle it and wiggle it to catch all the detail. But you have this, a fine figure of a woman with a straight back, a long kind of gown, but you can see her feet, and she's wearing this closed cap with jewelry, and she is just enough is shown, survives to show that she's holding one end of a rope, and at the other end of the rope there is a tall, old-looking bloke with a beard, and he's walking behind her at a respectful distance. His hands are tied together. So this is a ghost. This is a ghost. And the ghost, the recipe to deal with the ghost is this, that this attractive female is supposed to take him down to the underworld, where they can live happily ever after and not come back and trouble anybody at all. So we have to assume that a professional was consulted and extracts from the person who's suffering from these attentions. And then, well, it's a man, yes, old, you know, what else do you know about him? It might be this Uncle Gregory. Well, what can you tell me about Uncle Gregory? Well, Uncle Gregory always had to have a woman. When he wasn't married, there was always somebody in between. He was a bit of a chaser in that. Ah, said the exorcist. Well, I think that gives us a clue. So he decided that this ritual, providing a lover with equipment to take Uncle Gregory back where he belonged and keep him occupied, would save the household from any further visits. Now, the 2 things I want to tell you about this tablet is, this is, follow me closely, the oldest picture of a ghost ever discovered. That is really rather an exciting thing. And as a result, it's in the Guinness Book of Records. It's in the Guinness Book of Records as the oldest picture of a ghost known to man. And the gentleman on the left, who supervises it all, came in and checked everything, absolutely everything. And he agreed this was it. And so it's gone in. There's our certificate to prove it. And there's Imran, my dear colleague, holding in his special gloves the tablet itself for inspection. So not every tablet in the world has managed to get into the Guinness Book of Records. So it's most satisfactory. So, yes, I'm glad that this tablet's come up. But before I say anything about it, I just wanted to say that we have amulets, small rituals, complex rituals, and all manner of variations of the same in quite considerable abundance. um, one certainly couldn't talk about them all. Everybody would go home. But the point about it, I've given you a sprinkling of them, which actually stands for a considerable wealth of literature predicated on the need to send back to the underworld where they should be ghosts who come back to make a nuisance. And they're spread over about 2 millennia, and they vary from simple to complex, or another way of looking at it is as cheap and nasty to probably rather expensive. But there's an overwhelming body of evidence. And it's one of the things also, which in my opinion reinforces the idea that the belief in ghosts was not something like we have today, where people either do believe or they don't believe or they don't know. But basically, there are two classes of people. And that didn't apply in antiquity because it wasn't a matter for personal credulity. The fact was that people took ghosts for granted. This is a very, in my opinion, salient matter because that is the actual situation in antiquity about ghosts as such. And it's prevailing matter in many parts of the world today. If you ask questions, people who don't live in big and clever cities, but just live like they always do, ghosts are still around. Now, once in a while, in ancient Mesopotamia, somebody wanted to bring a ghost back deliberately to ask them a question. So it's not very common, but here we have part of a manual written by a Babylonian exorcist in about 500 BC. You can see there are 2 columns of writing. It's not complete. It's a bit like Australia, but it really ought to be square all around the edges. I found the bit at the top which has not been baked and stuck that on, and there are probably other bits in the department, but it's very hard to find them because we have 130,000 tablets. Anyway, the function here is to bring up a ghost from the netherworld to interrogate them. And there's only a sprinkling of texts that do this. This is what it looks like if you draw it all out. And it's about half of this is missing as well. It's most depressing, but there's quite a lot of incantations and rituals there. What you do is you bring up a skull. So this is a convenient skull, which I happen to have at my disposal. What happened in that ritual is that the skull is anointed with a horrible oily mixture made of weird things. And then the exorcist calls upon Shamash, the sun god, to bring up the spirit of the person to enter into the skull and answer questions. So this activity, the house has to be purified, all sorts of things have to go on. It's a load of hanky-panky before the actual occasion. And you can perhaps imagine that with 3 days of build-up and probably an empty bank account, you're going to call up somebody in the family for whom you have to ask a burning question that only they can answer. So when this all goes on and there's stuff swirling around and it's dark in the room, and probably the exorcist knew how to manipulate activity into high expectancy and so forth, and would ask the question of it. And if something happened that the jaw moved or something, the people would have a heart attack probably. But anyway, it's quite a serious matter to fool around with the dead like that, especially as all the other texts say, well, get rid of them, and you don't really want your particular person floating about once they've answered the question. So the manual, which I showed you, has lots of spells at the end to get rid of them again as soon as possible. So it's an interesting matter, this, because it's not just it's not a play or a kind of imaginary thing. It's a serious matter done under extreme necessity. And the perception is probably that you have to have the skull of the person you want to ask, which is likely to be something like your grandfather, because somebody in the family members is often in a vault or somehow accessible. It's possible you could, if necessary, procure the skull of your grandfather. But the other question about this, which I find very fascinating, is if you do ask in Babylonian a question, why is it that the assumption that underpins this and all other kinds of necromancy, which is what this is called, and the Greek texts and the Latin texts about necromancy always make the same assumption, A, that the person who is dead knows what's going to happen themselves, and B, are going to tell you the truth. Because It always seems to me you call up your grandfather, and your grandfather's had a lurking feeling of resentment against you because you broke a window in the greenhouse when you were 7 or something like that, which is what happens in families. And maybe the grandfather didn't really want to come up in the first place. Oh, I'll get my revenge on this little bugger, and said, "Oh yes, yes, you're going to the Grand National is going to be won by pulmonary vein. Put your money on that." Something like that, to get his own back. So the thing is rigid with complexity, but on a serious level, you know the king Ashurbanipal, who was king of the world, king of Assyria, and the most important king in the world ever, living in Nineveh. Well, he had an older brother who was supposed to be the next king, and this older brother wasn't quite as capable as Ashurbanipal. And Ashurbanipal hankered after becoming the next king when Esarhaddon, his father, died. And what happened was this. He, in the dead of night in the palace of Nineveh, called up the spirit of his dead grandmother and asked her whether he was going to be king. And she assured him that he would be. Now, that is also a rather hair-raising thing to imagine, because there were factions in the court, and imagine if word got out. So I don't know what he did with the result. It may just be that it gave him the confidence to do what he did, but that's something that happened in reality with the king of Assyria to be doing it. Oh, this is the spell. Should have gone before the other one. So this is it. Yes. May he bring up a ghost from the darkness for me. May he revivify the dead man's muscles. I call upon you, skull of all skulls. May he who is within the skull answer me. O Shamash, who opens the darkness. And then you have all this stuff. A male and female partridge, dust from a crossroads, dust from a jumping step cricket, and an upturned potsherd from a crossroads in anointing oil. You mix it all together, leave it to stand overnight. In the morning, you anoint either the ghost or a messenger, which could be a clay figure, or the skull, and you call upon him and he will answer you. And it says in Akkadian, you will see the ghost and he will speak with you. You can look at the ghost and he will talk with you. That's what it says. So that's quite a statement. Now, one interesting thing about belief, conviction, and so forth is that this idea that the dead can be interrogated by means of a skull to answer questions from the living survives beyond this. It surfaces in Greece and in Rome, as I said, this specific ritual with a skull. It's also in the Babylonian Talmud, where a 12th century rabbi called Rashi discusses a passage in which the skull is interrogated by would-be by someone who wants to have an answer. And the rabbi writes in the Aramaic commentary, of course, it is a question whether he really hears the ghost or whether he just thinks he does. So in the 12th century, this is a documentable stage in the contemplation of this kind of material. And I'm not saying that you didn't have skeptics or people who asked questions in much earlier times, but it is very remarkable that the exorcist says you will see the ghost and he will speak with you is very uncompromising. So I think it's quite likely that if the ghost did not appear, make the skull jump, something else might have happened. And at the very limit, as this rabbi remarked, perhaps the person in extremis thought he heard the voice himself. Who knows? But it's an interesting matter for speculation. Oh, this is the ritual. I've put them in the wrong place. I'm terribly sorry. This is the ritual about making the two figurines. It's just this. If a ghost seizes hold of a person and pursues him and cannot be loosed, you purify the potter's pit and throw barley flour into the potter's pit. You pinch off clay and make figurines of a man and a woman. You dress the man in an everyday shift and equip him with travel provisions. You wrap the woman in 4 red garments and clothe her in a purple cloth. You give her a golden brooch. You equip her fully with bed, chair, mat, and towel. You give her a comb and a flask. And at sunrise, towards the sun, you make the ritual arrangements and set up 2 carnelian vessels of beer. you set in place a special vessel and set up a juniper censer with juniper. You draw the curtain like the diviner does. You do something to the figurines together with their equipment and place them in position and say as follows. And then there's the beginning of the spell to Shamash. Shamash, Lord of the Broad, and then together with their travel provisions to the, and then he says, and do not look behind you. So when they're in this special pit, they're covered over, they go down to the underworld, and everybody lives happily ever after. Now, you, of course, are all familiar with the Witch of Endor in the Bible, where Solomon has outlawed sorcery and witchcraft in the land and banished it. And there's a marvelous description about how Solomon, at the end of his life, when the Philistines have come upon him and he's going to perish, he needs to find out what's going to happen. So what he does is he goes to what people in Britain always call the Witch of Endor, which is a place, although she wasn't a witch, and call upon her to call up the dead spirit of the prophet Samuel. So if you read this in your Bible, it is unambiguously clear what is going on. It is a very powerful, direct narrative written by a rather good journalist, because he goes up there and the woman says, what do you want with me? Why do you want? And he says, please bring up Samuel. And so that she does what she does. And then the ghostly figure, which is shown here of Samuel in this lovely painting, it's not a photograph from the occasion, this figure comes up. And when he sees Solomon, he said, why have you disturbed me? And that is a remarkable thing if you read the text, that the ghost doesn't say, hello, king, what do you need to know? Or he says that, why you just, as if he was on the couch watching television and the doorbell rings and, God damn it. It's something like, it's really funny. And anyway, he tells him the bad news and he goes back, and that's the end of him. But the story is really very fascinating. It would have made a very good Shakespeare play if Shakespeare had thought about it. But the thing is this, what I want to tell you is the following fact, that everybody calls her the Witch of Endor. And actually, this is a gross slander like the one with Pazuzu, because in the Hebrew, her name means the ghost mistress. The ghost mistress. And Endor is a place and nobody knows what it means. Now, the thing is, Solomon knew in order to get the answer that gets Samuel to come up, he had to go to the place which was the entrance to the underworld so that he would come out and talk to him. And he knew that this was at this place, Endor, where the ghost mistress operated. So they had there something comparable to the city where Inanna went down, the real Assyrian city where there was a temple with a door to the netherworld, where everybody knew that was the entrance to the netherworld. In Canaan, in the time of the biblical narrative, this place, Endor, was exactly where it was to be found. It was a parallel kind of institution. And on top of it, if you look in encyclopedias, nobody knows what Endor means. But in Hebrew, the letters Endor mean the well of generations. And that is a rather good idea. But not only is it poetic and suitable, but it's even more interesting in terms of Babylonia, because this, you remember that the netherworld was sealed off by 7 gates. And most of the time, people have always assumed that the gates were there to prevent anybody getting out. But I discovered some textual information which proves the following principle in ancient Mesopotamian culture, that for a new baby to come into the world, somebody had to die. And there was a balance involved where the life stuff, the very stuff of which human beings was made in proportion with clay and blood, as I explained before, that material was finite. And it had to be safeguarded so that for a new crying baby to appear in the world, it was a result of the spirit having left some other individual and being available. And the point about the gates was to let the spirits out, I believe, when needed. it was controlled, because if all the spirits got out, that would be a disaster. And that's what Ishtar says. The world will be overrun with them. She says it in that story. So you have a comparable situation in the Canaanite Israelite world, of a place which had an entrance to the netherworld and a person in charge of it, and it was called the Well of Generations, and presumably the underpinning idea was very comparable to the Babylonian one. So this doesn't mean reincarnation. It's nothing to do with reincarnation. It's to do with the idea that the life force which you might have in a flask and pour into one vessel was limited in its supply, and you were very careful with it. And then when it was not needed anymore, it would be poured into another vessel, that sort of idea. It's a rather beautiful idea. And the parallel between the text in the Bible, which hardly anybody ever mentions, and I tell you something, that Islamic and Christian and Jewish scholars who write about this, they do everything to demolish what it really means. It is an amazing piece of sophistry, because they don't like this crude, primitive, superstitious stuff being there, and they try and explain it all round. They try and second guess it and third guess it, but it doesn't work. Now, one other thing I want to show you, to show that the belief in ghosts was something which was generic to the psychological world in which they lived, that people took ghosts for granted. They didn't squabble about whether they existed, and they didn't say to one another, if you believe in these things, you're really stupid. So this is a piece of a royal inscription by an Assyrian king who'd been to Iran, and he'd found the palace. They'd run over, they'd slaughtered everybody, salted the earth, the usual kind of stuff. And then he wrote this by the tombs: I destroyed and demolished the tombs of their kings, earlier and later, who did not revere Ashur and Ishtar, my lords, and had disturbed the kings, my ancestors, and I exposed them to the sun. I took their bones to Assyria and prevented their ghosts from sleeping, and deprived them of funerary offerings and water pouring. Now that is the king, the military head of the massive state of Assyria, explaining in black and white on the wall of an inscription what he did. And that is not special pleading. It's not a euphemism. It's nothing of the kind. It is predicated on a deep-seated belief. And to prove it, look at this. When the Assyrian Empire came to an end, the Elamites, these same Elamites that he was talking about, overran the palace. And the Elamite soldiers had a special unit whose job was to emasculate or to weaken the sculptures. So cutting a bowstring, cutting their wrists, cutting their eyes out, things like that, to make the sculptures of the Assyrian king hateful as they were, powerless and impotent. And sometimes they slice right through the wrists and right through the legs. You can see it's the most marvelous and expressive thing. But this one is miraculous, because in front of the king, looking him in the eye at the same level, is an Elamite ghost, because the Elamite has carved the outline of the royal crown of Elam, and he's looking on the same level as Ashurnasirpal, the king, and he's looking at him steadily, and he's going to haunt the palace ever after. So you have the claim of using the ghosts of the dead as part of a military campaign, military climax, so to speak. Afterwards, they never forgot, and they put this ghost for all time there. So that's another portrayal of a ghost. Now, I have an idea. I wrote about this in the book. I don't know whether anybody else believes it. No one has said they do or they don't. That the belief in ghosts is a deep-seated human thing, which is almost impossible to eradicate. And that when you have an argument over the fence with your neighbor, and the neighbor saw a ghost, and you say, I don't believe in ghosts, and the neighbor said, well, I saw one, I did, and I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in ghosts. People who don't believe in ghosts, in my opinion, are wrong, because I believe that the ascription to the conception that a part of a human being leaves the rotten body and goes somewhere is from the beginning of the species. And to prove it, we have here, this is a Neanderthal skeleton. And since this photograph, I got hold of it, there'd been many excavations of Neanderthal graves, and the Neanderthal graves had in them objects, not like Tutankhamun with furniture and chariots, but they had objects, bits and pieces, jewelry, things like that, little bits of tools and things buried with the dead. In Neanderthal times already, never mind Homo sapiens. So the whole point here is that it seems to me that when we get to this stage of pre-human, near human and human, that the conception was already there intrinsically, that when a human being died, something survived. Something survived. I think it's locked into our, whatever it would be, not DNA, but locked in, it's kind of hardwired into the human psyche. And it goes back to the very beginning of our species and beyond, and it's ineradicable. So, oh, sorry, now this thing's going the wrong way. I want to prove this. It's a very simple thing to do. So I'd like participation in it if anyone wants to join in, because this is the situation. Anyone who's seen a ghost, they'll never forget it, and they'll never, ever, ever say they didn't. And people who've never seen a ghost either believe them or they don't believe them. And scientists and people in white coats don't believe them whatever they say, as a rule. So this is the situation. And all of these belief levels have nothing to do with reality, because the ghost matter, as I say, is common to the species, and it's gone on and on and on and on ever since. So I think that people who say they don't believe in ghosts and never will are wrong. And why do I think so? This is my plan. I'm going to rent this house. It's in Dartmoor in the winter. And we're going to have a long house party with about 20 um, uh, um, what they called top prize scholars, scientists. Can't remember the name. We get the best scientists in the world, 20 of them, to come to this party in this house in their white coats. And there'll be lots of drink and lots of music and lots of fun. And at 3 a.m, they'll all be exhausted, and they'll climb what remains of the stairs, and they'll go into a damp bedroom with a damp mattress in what remains of a bedroom, and they'll go into an uneasy sleep. And when they're all asleep, these Nobel Prizes, that's what I suppose, Nobel Prize scientists, this is what we need. So when we got them asleep, we'll get a big ladder and we go up the back of the house, and we go chins on the windowsill, and we go like that. And all these scientists will sit bolt upright in bed in panic and wet themselves. That is my conviction. And if you're interested in this and want to know anything more about it, in fact, if you want to read more than you probably do want to know about it, this is a useful thing. You can read it in the bath, you can read it in traffic jams, and you can scribble all over it. And I hope you found something of interest. So I'm going to stop talking, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be very delighted to try and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone has questions, you can use the raise hand feature and I'll call on you.
Great.
Anil?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation and hearing you talk about these things. It's very fascinating to me. My
Grand.
question is this:
Mhm.
was there a thought that while these ghosts can be raised, it's because they're not somehow permanently somewhere else? You know, in modern times, we think that once a ghost finally goes off to heaven or somewhere, it's finally gone and settled. And it's
Well,
only until they're not settled that they still can come back. I mean, just an idea.
well, the thing is this, the Mesopotamians didn't have heaven and hell, and they certainly didn't have limbo, and they certainly didn't punish people after death for things they'd done in their lives. All that stuff came later. So they had this great place called the Netherworld, where the ghosts hang about, like Ishtar said, in the dust and hang around. worrying about water. And it's rather like a railway station, people standing there waiting and waiting and waiting, and they're never quite sure what's going to happen. And the point about the underworld is that the description of it by the poets is horrendous. It's horrendous because you have clay to eat and all this kind of thing, and everybody you don't know don't like is there, and it goes, and more and more and more and more people come. But the thing is, my idea that gradually the ghosts were released when needed meant that they were only there temporarily, and there was a sort of recycling movement, as I understand it. That's how it worked. So the question of going up to heaven or going down to it just didn't apply. They all went to this clearing station, so to speak, and we don't know how long they were there, but I can tell you something very fascinating, that there were places in the underworld where there were thieves, and where there were danger, and there were places in the underworld where there were foreigners. And for example, one of the problems about water which beset the ghosts is that the Amorites, the Amorites were in charge of the water, and they were very unfriendly. Now, the thing is, the Amorites were real people who lived in the second millennium. And the fact that they extrapolated from the past to make this, to link them with the problem over water, undoubtedly is an echo of serious warfare about water rights a millennium or so before this tablet describing the netherworld was written. So there's a kind of funny blend of suspension of belief necessary, and then a funny blend of what's obviously just like our world, but down there, sort of thing. It's interesting that the ghosts that we do have are both portrayed as human beings, but otherwise, if one shrugs off the heaven and hell, and especially limbo, which I gathered that the Pope cancelled before anyway, it's a jolly good idea, limbo being cancelled. If you get rid of all those things, then the situation was simpler. I have to say, having read all the texts about the underworld, I translated quite a lot in that book. If I was a ghost, I'd want to be out of there. I mean, it's not very satisfactory. I would certainly try and escape for a bit of fun.
Thank you. Ben, I see you have your hand up. I just want to ask two quick follow-up things, if you don't mind, Ben.
No, I'm fine.
A,
It's fine.
are there a lot more tablets still in the sands? And B, are computational techniques to put them together helping sort through the 130,000 you have in stock?
Good question. Good question. Well, the first thing is that tablets from antiquity, and for 3,000 years of writing, all the cities of Mesopotamia had writing. If they weren't deliberately destroyed or thrown in the river, they're probably all still in the ground. So there are probably millions of tablets in the ground, millions, I would think. And it's probably a good thing that most of them are there for a while. But in the end, more and more will be discovered and translated and made available. As for what the other question about using, I suppose what you might call AI or something like it, there's a lot of interest in this. And yes, it can certainly be done. All of the, for example, we have 20,000 tablets from Nineveh that belong to Ashurbanipal's own personal scholarly library, and they've all been photographed digitally very, very successfully. And it's possible, it would be possible to take the digital photographs of the broken shapes and match them. This is one possibility. It's just expensive and complex, but that could be done. And secondly, a computer could be taught to read cuneiform so that it could make joins by, I mean, if I can do it, for sure as hell, a computer can do it. So it could be done. It's just not a priority for anybody to put into it what would be necessary. But I think for sure, I mean, a lot of people write in asking about it, and it's sort of a thing which is on its way. So both joins and translations could be done, but the computing would have to be very elaborate and complex and very costly. So anyway, I mean, I'll probably die before I have to give way to a computer. That's my plan.
Thank you so much.
Ben, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, great. First of all, I just want to say that's a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been following your YouTube videos for a while, and a big fan. So, wanted to say that I first question is about how you mentioned that Ashurbanipal sort of summoned or attempted to summon his ancestor to try to or if it was grandmother or grandfather to
Mhm.
get justification
Grandmother,
for
yeah,
his grandmother.
yeah.
Okay, so to get justification to legitimize his rule, I'm wondering about the sources for that. Was that from his private correspondence tablets, or
There's a
was that
letter.
something
There's
the
a
let?
letter about it, which it must have been a top secret letter. I mean, if it fell into the wrong hands, it would be very dangerous. But there is a letter which refers to it, and it may be that he wrote it. The letter was written down after he was king, and they'll be immune from any kind of trouble. But I think when when the father was still alive, there were factions in the palace in support of one and the other. I mean, I can't imagine that Ashurbanipal could have done that without the help of one of the royal exorcists, but he must have been sworn to secrecy um, or something like that.
That was in his library that is in the British Museum.
Yes, because all the tablets from Nineveh, almost all of them, were found basically in two rooms, and most of them came to London in the 1850s.
Okay,
And so that's how we know all this stuff.
great.
And hold on, I'll be 2 seconds. Um, yeah, so that is the situation. Mm.
Well, thank you. I had a one quick question also. I was wondering, so I'm sort of a hobbyist linguist,
Mhm.
trying to learn Akkadian and Sumerian on my own through the resources online and the digital facsimiles that are available, and working with scholarship and that sort of thing. I just was wondering, as since I'm not a trained Assyriologist, and I don't just wondering about if so I've seen some videos of yours where there are volunteers who to work with the British Museum to help identify different tablets and joins and working with professional Assyriologists such as yourself. I was wondering about how, if you could speak a little bit about how one, as a hobbyist, could maybe get involved with assisting museum curators and that sort of thing without having necessarily a PhD, but having a
Well,
vested interest in being a volunteer.
mm, well, all museums depend on volunteers nowadays, and we do too, although not all the time. I mean, there are 2 points to your question about learning this. Um, um, there's a series of books called Teach Yourself, which sound dreadful, and there's one called Teach Yourself Babylonian, which is brilliant. It's written by my friend Martin, whose second name's gone out of my head, having just given this lecture. He used to teach at Cambridge. He's now in Trinity College, Dublin. He wrote this marvelous grammar, which is designed to help people who are interested to work steadily through the material and to not to do the next bit till you've learnt the first bit. And it's quite suitable for home study. You can really get a handle on Akkadian by doing that if you want to.
Great.
Um, I don't know where you live or what's available, but sometimes there are classes you can go to. But I mean, you can work through that book. I wish I could remember his name. I have to look it up. In fact, if you look it up on your computer, you'll find it. It's a brilliant. I've got it here. I should have it to hand. It's very annoying because there are grammars, complex and simple. Um, it's way and above the most suitable thing for home consumption by a person like yourself. It's really excellent.
Great.
Anyway, it's called Teach Yourself Babylonian. There, get the new edition of it.
Wonderful. Thank you for the
Yeah.
recommendation.
Mm. As for working, it's a bit difficult to say. I mean, that lady who found a bit of the tablet, it's rather a comic thing because I did this evening class years and years ago, and nobody wanted to stop, so we did one year, then we did another year, then we did another year, and it was beginning to get a bit much. And when I decided I would stop, she wanted to do something more with cuneiform, so that's why she ended up sorting out those fragments, and that triangle of the map came to light. But th th what happened with her is not a sort of common development.
Right.
I
It
mean,
seemed pretty extraordinary that happens. I was just wondering.
yes. Well, I mean, she was very keen and quite elderly, and I didn't have the heart to say. I didn't think anything would come of it really. And then this thing turned up, and of course, when I saw it, I had nearly passed out of excitement. It's really a brilliant thing. But where do you live? I mean, it's partly that, you know, you'd have to
Um,
volunteer.
I'm outside of Washington D.C., but I don't want to hold up other questions and
Okay.
other
Well,
things.
the thing to do is to go to a museum near you and find out. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, good luck with it.
Okay. Thank you very
If I
much.
think of the name, I'll mention it. But it's Martin, definitely the first name. All right, good.
Thank you.
I think we have maybe time for one more question, and then we'll wrap things up. Kelly?
Thank you. Like so many here, I am enthralled by this. This has just been marvelous, and I thank you so much. I've been thinking of the phrase, the unquiet grave, and
Yes.
you've made reference to ghosts appearing with a purpose,
Mm.
such as not getting pure water,
Mm.
which would, I understand now, that's important. Uh, are there examples from Mesopotamia of ghosts appearing uh, because of a wrong they might have experienced in
Yes.
lifetime?
Very good question. As a matter of fact, um, the people who were responsible for this made a list of the sort of people who might be expected to be a ghost. It was obviously a tool for them. And it's a very long list. And I wrote them all out in this book. And one of the people on Amazon said, "Why do you put all these lists in?" I thought, charming, because it's so revealing. I mean, for example, a woman who dies in childbirth is a classic case. And someone who's killed by a chariot, burned in fire, falls down a well. There's about 35 different possibilities that people who came to a sticky end like that, especially if their body wasn't buried and they didn't go through all the procedures, they're likely to have a rough time. And there are mentions of ghosts who roam unsatisfied through the world for the end of, to the end of time. It's a kind of thing like that. There's no solution. If the body's burnt up, it's a very difficult problem. So actually, the treatment of the dead after battles is probably a rather revealing thing. I have to tell you one thing now you're here, that about the modern belief in ghosts, because I think it's, as it were, a natural stratum. And when religion came along and then science, it all went underground. It kind of got squashed so that people don't blab about it in case anybody laughs at them. But when I went to a literary festival, a couple of years ago, I was the last speaker. We all went out for dinner in this restaurant, about 20 people. It was good fun. And then near the end of the meal, this lady came over from the other end of the table. She said, "I was very interested to hear what you had to say about these ghosts because something happened to me." And because I wrote this book, lots of people have come up to me and said something happened to me. But when she said it, it was obvious that she spent the whole of the meal table trying to pluck up courage to come and tell me. And this is what she said, that when she was a girl, about 17, I suppose, that sort of age, she was in her schoolgirl bedroom, looking out the window, supposed to be doing homework, which overlooked the garden. And she saw, she described to me, not in a fluent, well-rehearsed and party piece kind of way, but rather falteringly and hesitantly, she said, "I saw my grandfather walking across the lawn." And her grandfather was dead. And, if a strange old twerp is walking across your lawn, you might want to know what the hell he's doing in your garden, but you wouldn't mistake him for your grandfather, especially if your grandfather was dead. So it's quite a revealing thing that she identified him as her grandfather. She probably knew what he looked like. Anyway, when she recovered, she told me she went downstairs into the kitchen where her mother had her chin on her hands, looking out the kitchen window over the garden. And when she went in the kitchen, her mother turned round and said, "You're never going to believe this, but I just saw my dad walking across the lawn." So that's a kind of interesting narrative that you can only dismantle if you say that the witness who makes this statement is a complete arrant liar or a free inventor or something like that, which she so visibly wasn't. She was a lady of about my age, and she clearly never talked about it in between, clearly not. So you could see that it wasn't a party piece, as I said. And so either you have to say that if it's not invention, if it happened. If it happened, then it's an extraordinary thing. And if it didn't, what kind of invention would think of a thing like that anyway? Because she wasn't that sort of person. I was really taken aback by it because people have told me hundreds of things about seeing ghosts, hundreds of things. And what happens is they boil down to a series of things which are, there's a kind of a series of generic things that happen in the narratives. And it's not only in living people you might meet, but also in literature and anthropology and right across the world. And it adds up to something peculiar. But this was a smart, sewn up thing that if she wasn't drunk, hallucinating, or a really good liar, that was quite an interesting example of seeing a ghost. Two different people who couldn't be wrong. So there you are. Anyway, when you see one, send me a message. I never have. It's a great nuisance to me. A great nuisance. Anyway, it's very nice to meet you all, even in this bizarre way. Thank you very much for inviting me.